Max Gorlin, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey friends, you got MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well. And number 25 of the 50 most relevant is where we find ourselves today. Officially over the halfway mark and now into some very, very relevant names across SuperCoach, DreamTeam and AFL Fantasy. Marcus the Bont Bontempelli is who we are talking about today. If this is a SuperCoach 50 most relevant, without doubt, he's all the way up higher than where he is based on what he can do. If he'd retained his forward status that he gained last year, he's going to be a little bit higher. But we'll talk about, as we go through this episode, why I've got him pretty much smack bang in the middle of the 50 most relevant. It's been a couple of days since we've had the great one Kane on, back since we talked about Max Gawn just a few days ago. And it's good to have Kane back. Hello, buddy. How are you?
Really well, MJ. This is a gun of the competition. It's funny when you look through his averages. I thought they'd be higher across his career. Like, he's been unbelievable. I was just in awe, to be honest, that in his past 8 seasons, he's barely missed a handful of games across those 8 seasons.
Yep.
The DT average is just ridiculous. It's near on 100 across 8 years. And that first year of the 8 was his second season in the comp, which I know you teased on the podcast the other day. And the SuperCoach stuff, like you mentioned off the top, he's just unbelievable. He's perennially a top 8 guy, even in that real pointy end of top 3, 4, 5 midfielders. So he's fascinating. I noticed you put him right in the middle.
Yeah, right. And that's for a reason, which we want to get to that. We look over what he did last year, and we'll talk even more detail in a second about what Kane's alluded to, just that incredible scoring consistency for so long. 27 years old, midfield eligible. So even though we gained him at the round 6 DPP as a mid forward last year across the formats, he did lose that. And no one should really be surprised. He kind of scraped into the DPP threshold over those first 5 or 6 weeks. And as a result, CBA's really popped after that. He's back as a mid where he's been for a lot of his career. 145 last year against the Fremantle Dockers in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam. Wasn't just his highest score of 2022 in that format, a career high score in that format last year, while a 181 in SuperCoach against the Saints, a nice 22 seasonal high, but that is well shy of that COVID bubble year of 2020, where if you remember watching him take on the Adelaide Crows, it was when they were arguably at their worst, and he destroyed them in that game with a 199 in SuperCoach. Really champion data. Just give him the 1 point. He deserved it. His average, he's pretty much a flatline ton for you in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam. It means in those 2 formats, he's just a touch over $910,000 in DreamTeam, well, a fraction under $900,000 in AFL Fantasy. A 116 average in SuperCoach means in that format, $639,500. And Kane, you alluded to a couple of things there right at the top of the episode. Since season 2, he's barely missed a game of football. Since season 2, he was a mid-forward eligible for us that year, breakout season, and became a premium for us year 2. Since 2015, his lowest seasonal average is a 92.3 in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam and a 102.9. He's one of the most damaging players in the game. When the game is on the line in the contest, what do the Bulldogs do? They make sure Bont's around the ball. When there's a clean bit of footy that needs to be used, they look to get the ball in his hands. When there's a contest or a clearance, whenever something the Bulldogs need at any part of their game, Luke Beveridge has had the blessing for the better part of his coaching career to lean to a modern-day great, and almost without fail, Bont has not failed the Bulldogs or fantasy coaches for the better part of half a decade.
No, spot on, MJ. And I think that's always the important thing when we look at, the numbers is what's some of the context behind the numbers? Because when I just think back to Bont's season last year, it felt like everyone was underwhelmed. We were hearing how he was battling with injury. and especially in that early part of the season, and I guess this is where the burn really set in last year, wasn't it, MJ? Was the coaches that started him.
Yeah.
Because he was just,
He was
hovering around that. Yeah, like it was fine. 5 weeks, it was 101 in DT, 111 in SuperCoach. Now it's clearly unders off the back of that 2021 season.
Yeah.
But clearly it was the next 2 weeks where that injury noise started getting really loud. He went 73 and 84 in DT, 88 and 115 in SuperCoach. And then he actually missed that round 8 game. They really,
right.
He was struggling. We heard that it was one of those things where we're going to give him the week, try to freshen him up a bit. And since then, it was basically back to the Bont that we know and love. From round 9 onwards, it was 104 DT and 120 SuperCoach. So I think that's where we're looking in terms of value. I think that is where we're at with him. And maybe that's why we couldn't put him up much higher, because he doesn't ever play bad enough to get him cheap. In terms of starting a new season, yeah, there might be opportunities in a season, as we always know, but
absolutely,
as we sit here right now, and this is obviously all as we build our starting squads, is Bont still had a really good season last year, albeit below his usual output. 100 DT MJ and 116 SuperCoach. That's still really, really good, especially in SuperCoach where we know that's more his game. He's never really been a guy that we go, if I start him, I'm going to keep him for the whole year in detail. I'm really confident he's top 8. And if I don't start him, he's right on the top of that big board of, I want him in my team throughout the season. He's been a guy that if it lines up and it's the right price when you're upgrading, you're more than happy to grab him. But he's not a guy, if you don't start, that you say, I'm putting a spot aside in my team.
Yeah.
And as I upgrade one of those upgrades needs to be Bont, which we know in the past, if you didn't start a Tom Mitchell, you were like walking on eggshells until you could make that trade and put him in the team. But we know in SuperCoach, he is that guy. When you're, building your team, you're picking your starting mids, you're jotting down the ones you want. He's always in that list of ones you want because he's always around the mark. And I think that's the fascinating thing, MJ. 100 in DT, he's shown that he can get up towards 108, which he's right on that fringe of being top 8, but also providing a good amount of value.
Yes.
Whereas when you look at the SuperCoach side, 116, he hasn't shown across a season that he can go much higher than that in terms of his career years. I say only a 119. But I know delving deep into that 2021 season, which, he was so close to winning a Brownlow, there was long stretches, more than half a season where he averaged 130.
It's insane.
So I think that's what's interesting is that he's already better in SuperCoach.
Yes.
Now he's better priced and he hasn't shown on career averages to only go from 116 last year to his career year of 119. But it does feel like with a guy like Bont, there is a season where it's 120 plus at least.
Yeah. And could it be this season? And that is the big question for coaches. 4 years in a row in SuperCoach, where he's gone 114, 116. Look, really, if you round up that 119.7, he's there at the 120 mark. And then last year, the 116. He is, without question, in that format of SuperCoach, one of the safest players to start the season going, will this premium midfielder go 110? The answer with Bont is, barring injury, yes, because in that format, everything he does brilliantly. That format rewards. Whereas Dream Team and Fantasy, where volume of ball is more valuable, he still gets more than his lion's share of it. But when you've got some other names in that side that also have and get plenty of football, he becomes more valuable with the impact of what he does with those possessions rather than without it. And we see that contrast even just last year. 11 tons in Dream Team and Fantasy, just the two of them, he translates them into 120 plus scores. Now, last season prior to that, so 2021, it was around about a 50% conversion of hundreds turning into 120s in Dream Team, which alludes to that career year that Kane talked about. While in SuperCoach last year, those 18 tons that he scored, 7 of them he translated into 120 plus scores. You look at what he did in 2021 and 16 tons, 12 over 120. He does have the 150 plus ceiling about him too, which does help that. Now, remember, I just glossed over 18 tons as if it's not much. 3 games last year, he didn't hit the 100 marker in SuperCoach. Just 3, which is ridiculous. And of those 3, the lowest was 88. So when you look at Bontempelli, you're looking at a player that in SuperCoach, safe, can be a captaincy consideration, has pushed the limit of 120. And when you think of volatility of can a guy get tagged out of a game, Bontempelli is almost untaggable, either because someone can't match him at ground level and so he beats them in the air, or they can match him in the air and he beats them at ground level, or they can do both, but they can't athletically hold with endurance with him. He's just so good in so many different areas. He's durable, as Kane's mentioned. It's always there. But I suppose I've got 2 questions. Really, it's 3 questions I want to ask you, Kane. With a guy that's as safe and dependable, really across the formats, I think what we're paying for is what he probably is. What's your philosophy? Is that just take it, you don't need upside at that price point? Or are you thinking, no, he'll drop away and I could get him there? What's your process with a guy like Bont, who's really his standard variation of scoring and cash really isn't that much?
Yeah, I think it's different for all the formats, MJ, just because of the nature of his upside. I think for SuperCoach, I do see an upside. I look back at last season and I see that, this is a guy that, as I mentioned, he had to have round 8 off, which is really rare for him. But I look what he did post-buy, and it feels more the Bontempelli we know. So it was 105 DT, but it was 122 in SuperCoach. And it was back to that consistency, of that final run of games. Low scored 98. All the rest were over 100.
Yeah.
So some of those ceiling games were back in there. Some of those ceiling games were back to back. He went 181, 161.
Cool.
I just feel like in that format, there's enough of a jump that you're also getting top 8 with a little bit of value. Now we know the game is changing with the extra trades. We have to adjust our logic to that. Now, I think as we sit here now in late Jan, that's really hard to talk structure without the rookies, because if you're flush with rookies, clearly you need to spend your cash somewhere, and you're going to have a more guns and rookies approach. Now, clearly, if we don't have as many rookies, you can't afford those premiums, and thus the mid prices come in. So I find it really interesting because we know that a lot of those mid prices popped last year. So there's that balancing act of, last year mid prices worked. And people were able to pick them and they did a great role. Some of them even were season-long keepers. Yes. But that's always the hard thing with fantasy footy, MJ, isn't it? Is just because it worked last year doesn't mean it will work the next year. Now, we can always, glean things from it, and we're always trying to improve. But at the end of the day, it's about picking players that are going to improve, that are going to create value, or are going to be guys that we want for the whole year and just give us the most important thing, which is points.
Yes.
As much as we love cash, and we know that cash, end of the day, serves the purpose of getting more points. So my point being for Bontempelli and SuperCoach, I think he does present a bit of upside.
Yep.
I think there might be, 2 to 3 to 4, maybe 5, 6 if you're lucky, if it's one of those seasons where he's absolutely red hot. I think some of the reasons for that is, Josh Dunkley's departure should open up a midfield spot. Now, we know they're very deep in the midfield.
Yes.
But also the forward line's been strengthened, not just with the draft and recruiting of the previous years with Jamara, the flexibility of a Sam Darcy coming in. Aaron Norton's really consolidated himself as an alpha of the competition. But also we know, a Rory Lobb's come in. Tim English is really proficient if he needs to go forward as well. So it feels like in the forward line, they're quite deep. But we do know that they're not afraid to spin a Caleb Daniel through there, an Adam Treloar, Bailey Smith, Liberatore, McRae and Bont. That's just, people would dream of that midfield, let alone the depth that they can incorporate. So I always wonder, is that something that has clipped Bont in the past? A Tuke Miller or Jack Steele maybe don't quite have the support that a Bont does. Because when you're talking about getting clearance, it's hard to beat Tom Liberatore. When you're talking about a bit of that mix, McRae he's in that. He can get a clearance, but also he's one of the best kicks inside 50 in the comp. So there's some competition, and that does suck away some of those points that maybe would go to Bont if he didn't have that support. In DT and AF, MJ,
Mm.
AF, it feels like more of a play if you're hoping for a return to that 108. You're getting your 7-8 points of upside.
Yeah.
He's around the mark. If you had to hold him because you've got some other dramas, you're happy to. If you're really flush, he's a guy you could move around his bye and just maybe get to that next year. But like always, you're watching to see what happens ahead. If the 8th midfielder's doing what he's doing, you're going to just strengthen elsewhere. So for me, that's the thing I think is really fascinating. I think the coaches that are leaning into Bont see that it was a regression on 2021.
Yep.
They love the narrative of Dunkley out, Lob in, Jamara developing, Darcy and Josh Bruce even can provide some flexibility back forward. So I guess with Bont, what's happened in the past, if there has been a run of injuries, which we did see at the start of last year.
We did,
when Bruce
which is how we got the DPP.
Back in the team. Yeah, exactly. He earned that DPP for a reason. So that's another factor, I think, where for me, I've just gone, okay, when we got to post-bye, it was a lot more of a stable role for him. The body was back where he knows it can be. And he started performing at about 5 to 6 points of upside. So I think that's where you're at. But at the end of the day, MJ, it is Marcus Bontempelli. He could have that breakout uber.
A 110 year in Dream Team and Fantasy is well
and
within
his capacity. And a 125 in SuperCoach isn't out of the question. So I think that's where he's really tough is there's guys like a Tom Green, a Luke Davies-Uniacke, Tom Mitchell that are, a sizable price cheaper that are people are sort of forecasting that they'll get close enough. And that's maybe where a Bont is hard for some people is they're looking at Oliver. They're looking at McRae, who has done those consistent 120 plus scores. A Miller with that buy is quite advantageous now with that coming out that, it's going to be best 18 in that Geelong and Gold Coast week. So I think what's happening is people are going, Oliver's done this massive average before. Laird's done it before. McRae, Steele, Miller. I like them.
Yeah.
I like a bit of value chasing a Green, a Davies-Uniacke, Mitchell, take your pick in that sort of bracket.
Totally.
So I think he might be a guy that gets a bit more momentum, MJ, as people start, or even I reckon as they get closer to the preseason where we go, I need to save 30K here because I need to get a rookie that I didn't think I'd need to get. We know that's where I think he would come in. But I think
I'll drop Miller down to Bont because it gets me the structure I want.
You sort of start chasing those pennies, don't you? And you don't want to maybe change the rest of your team. And I think you'd be very happy with that. But I think as we sit here now, he is getting slept on a little bit across the formats just because you want the top, the guys you feel you have massive confidence in being top 3.
Yes.
Or you're looking for those guys that are a bit cheaper than a Bont and you think can get to that tier. They're going to have their big jump here. So I think that's always an interesting thing in the starting squad, isn't it? Is what's your balance? How are you building? What are you sort of looking for in that first 2 weeks when you've got that free look? What are you trying to build into your team that you can maybe be quite flexible with that trade boost in particular in DT and SuperCoach?
Yeah.
To restructure your team and maybe grab any of those mid-prices or rookies you've missed.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. He's got this history over his career in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team of being 100 to 105 guy, but having these 6, 8, 10-week stretches of going 115. If you can time him right in that format, you're away. In SuperCoach, safest 110 guy just about in the comp, like probably outside of an Oliver in SuperCoach. He's as safe as you get historically alongside of his teammate in Jackson McRae. So I think the narrative you're telling yourself, if you're choosing to look at Bont as an upgrade of going, I think he's just going to give me what he is. And as I get through the season, at the right price, I'll jump on. For those that are looking at him, you're looking at the potential inbuilt value that Kane has mentioned, both from what he did in 2021, what some role changes have happened around him through trade. By the way, in 2021, there was 11 games that Dunkley didn't play for the Western Bulldogs. In the 11 games they played together in 2021, Bont averaged 97.2 and a 107.2 in SuperCoach. However, In the 11 without him, he went at 118.5 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team and 132 in SuperCoach. So we're talking a differential of 21.4 points in Fantasy and Dream Team and 25 in SuperCoach. So these are the little things you start to tell yourself with Bont of, at worst, he'll be what he is. At best, I could get the banner year out of him. And these become the factors. And as Kane's mentioned, that $30,000 doesn't sound like much now. But as you've seen the rolling lockout start, a player in your team not have the greatest start, you look at the Bulldogs fixture, you look at how many games at Marvel, and all of a sudden you find yourself talking about a guy that you're like, oh, I'll get him later. And you have him. It's why 25% of super coaches right now are just trying to go, I'll just take it. It's safe. A few days ago, we talked about Zach Merritt in Fantasy and Dream Team, one of the safest 105 midfielders you can get. And I think there are some parallels in SuperCoach for Bontempelli. Safe, reliable, durable, but maybe with some upside. And if you can time it right, then you really get the cherry on top. He's a good player to own. His draft day is interesting to me, though, Kane. Definitely a format-dependent player. Were you picking him on draft day?
I think if we start with the SuperCoach side,
Sure.
MJ, he is in that second round, early third. It'd be hard to see him be much into the third round just with the pedigree that he's got and how safe. So I think for me, second is where you're paying. We know that the midfield line is really, really stacked. There's so many guys that are really, really good, but I just think, guys like a Darcy Parish who are sort of that rung below, like they're not going ahead of him.
No.
Yeah, maybe you could argue the guys above him would all go ahead of him depending on your draft, but I just think, I've got him in that top 8 midfield range.
He'll be a pretty popular M1, won't he?
Yeah, absolutely, MJ. The only way you're getting him as an M2 is if you probably,
on the turn.
Yeah, if you're on the turn and you go mid. But for me, he'd be mid-second round, early second round is where I'd have him, just purely because you keep it moving. He's going to be in that discussion. Obviously, captain's on helps him a bit more than off, because if it's off, you're more inclined to go for those forwards and get that depth. But if you need the captaincy, Bont's always good there. Now, in the midfield, he is that rung below. I think he's more
in
of
Dream Team and Fantasy.
Yeah. I think he's more of an M2.
Yep, I think so too.
And that's okay. Like probably a late M2 at that, maybe even bordering on M3. Clearly there's upside there, but again, you're arguing for a lot of guys below too that can make that jump. Parish and Tom Mitchell have all shown that they can have their own runs of form, but the durability, the reliability of role, being the captain, and just being one of the best players in the competition, that's always a great tiebreaker for me. If you're having concerns about, how will that Essendon midfield structure up with a new coach? How will Tom Mitchell go at a new club? Like, you sleep easy with Bontempelli. And I think for some coaches, there's big appeal in that. And that's always the beauty of draft, isn't it, MJ? There's some people who go, I'm always going all upside. If everything breaks right, I want the highest upside. And there's some people who can go, I'll do a bit of this, do a bit of that. I'll take more of my risks in, round 8, 9, 10 onwards. Yeah. And obviously, some people are just, I'll be super liberal with that waiver wire in the first couple of weeks, and just anyone that pops, I'm just on and hope you get it that way. So I think Parish for a lot of coaches Bontempelli is just safety. Just safety. I feel good. Who knows? There could be a forward status, but I'd be surprised. It would take a lot of injury carnage at the Dogs to move in there.
It's a stress-free selection, isn't it? It's that pick where
100%.
you go, I know you don't win your draft historically in the first handful of picks. So he won't win you the draft, but what he will do is he will be a very, very nice building block for you, no matter what you choose to do in the middle and latter portions of your draft. Hey, Kane, as always, mate, an absolute pleasure. So thank you for your fine work on this conversation around Marcus Bontempelli.
No worries, MJ. Pleasure.
If you want to go and check out the article on Bont or any of the other players we've revealed so far on the 50 most relevant, you can go and check it out at coachespanel.tv. Not only are all the articles of the 50 most relevant that have been revealed up there for you now, there's some official open leagues for AFL Fantasy and the official groups for SuperCoach. You can go and get in those, kind of pit yourself against not just members of the Coaches Panel are in there, but the followers of the Coaches Panel community. There are some very, very good coaches that will be in that group. So if you think you've got what it takes to be the top member in one of the fantasy footy groups of the Coaches Panel, all the links you can find for that are at coachespanel.tv. If you're enjoying these podcasts, leave a nice 5-star rating and a review. It helps others that are looking for fantasy footy content help find the Coaches Panel that haven't found it just yet. And of course, for just a couple of bucks a month, you can join our Patreon. You get exclusive content, hidden access to a bunch of groups, podcasts, early access to these, and a heap of other elements. All the links to join our Patreon supporter group, you can find them too at coachespanel.tv. So tomorrow, we start to get into the 24s, we're going to say is mid-20s. Let's go with it. The mid of the early 20s, 24. He historically has been one of the great premiums of fantasy football, like one of the modern day greats. There were some things last year that didn't go his way. Some of them, in fact, I would say all of them, were outside of his control. But he's got a bright new future in 2023. And in a line that people are really divided over, he could be the difference. Who am I talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.